I'd like to thank you all for showing up. This is 1863. So last year, Todd and I got to talking about how this was the 160th anniversary of the year 1863, which the premise of which is that 1863 was the key year in the American Civil War, and you'll get, I think, more than enough an explanation of why we think that's the case. At first we were talking about doing something about Gettysburg, but then, of course, the lovely people at James A. Garfield National Historic Site already cover Gettysburg, and they already also cover the Gettysburg Address. So we thought we would do something a little more extensive and just talk about the year generally. So before I begin, I'm John Foster. I'm a reference librarian here at Mentor Public Library. I have a PhD in European history, and I've been doing talks here for 8 or 9 years, and I try and do these sort of talks on things I'm interested in reading some books about. And tonight I'm joined by Todd Arrington, who's the head ranger? Is that
Site manager.
Yeah, of the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. National Historic Site, I forgot national in the poster originally, for which I apologize.
It's okay.
And I've had the good fortune to see Ranger Todd give a lot of talks here in the course of Leaders and Legacies of the Civil War. And so we just thought that this would be a fun thing to do. So the start of the story that we want to tell takes place in July, late July, the third week of July of 1862, when Lincoln called his cabinet together and told them that he had reached a momentous decision, and he pulled out a little piece of paper and read what would become the text of the Emancipation Proclamation. And he read this in front of his cabinet, and his cabinet was pretty supportive. By this time, most of his cabinet, with the exception of Salmon P. Chase, I shouldn't say that. Salmon P. Chase was a great guy and had some sort of differences with Lincoln, and then Lincoln put him on the Supreme Court, so really no hard feelings, I think it's fair to say. But Lincoln had a somewhat tendentious relationship with his cabinet earlier on. Several of them had run against him for the president. Most of them thought they could do the job better than he could. Lincoln is a fascinating guy, too, as we'll get into this talk. Lincoln very much played up his sort of like rural roots. Lincoln is one of the smartest, canniest men that ever occupied the White House, and it's sometimes funny when you hear him. You know, he had a wealth of kind of earthy stories, like the following, just to sort of give you an example. This is related in the book about the last trial he was in before he went into politics. He told the story while he was riding the circuit in Illinois. He was brought into a case where a woman had this husband who was kind of a drunk, and he was abusive, and finally she walloped him on the head with a log and killed him. And Lincoln was, how the circuit would work. The lawyers would come around, and you would just sort of get assigned to different cases, and he was brought in to sort of defend her. So she was in a room in the courthouse, and he went in and interviewed her. About an hour later, the bailiff went in and found that she was gone. And the prosecutor went to him and said, or the judge went to him and said, "Abe, did you help her to escape?" And Lincoln, telling this story about himself, said, "Well, no. She just said that she had a bit of a thirst, and I told her there was some mighty good water to be had in Tennessee." And this is a great Abraham Lincoln story, right? Because who knows if it actually happened, right? But it's the kind of story that Lincoln liked to tell about himself. And it was his way of disarming people. And the people who really made mistakes around Lincoln were the people who underestimated what Lincoln was all about. He was a very canny man. But he was proposing to announce this measure immediately. And Seward, who was the Secretary of State, I don't know why I froze on that, but yes, but this is why I have Todd with me, because my mind is, like I said. Seward said, well, this had just come at the end of a series of battles which the Union had not come off terribly well in, associated with McClellan's failed attempt to take Richmond. And Seward said, well, I don't think that this is necessarily the right time. It would sound like, as Seward put it, the last shriek on the retreat, right? So what Lincoln was proposing to do was to free the slaves. Now, he was not going to free all the slaves. And Lincoln's relationship to slavery is kind of interesting. Sometimes people, particularly people who kind of want to revise ideas about the Civil War, will say, well, Lincoln made that famous comment that if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. And if I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. And if I could save the Union by freeing some of the slaves and leaving others undisturbed, I would also do that. And it's clear that if you read, I think, Lincoln's letters reasonably sympathetically, that he really did think that slavery was a bad idea. He did not have what we would call modern egalitarian views about race, to be fair. And he did go along with the idea of recolonizing freed slaves back into Africa until he was visited by a delegation of black religious leaders who essentially said to him, well, none of us have ever been to Africa, so why would we want to go back there? It's not back there. Why would we want to go there? We're Americans. We want to live here. We just want to live here with the rights that the Constitution promises us. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the idea of it was not that he was going to free every slave. He was only going to free slaves in areas that were then in rebellion, right? So he was not going to free slaves in the border states. And why was he not going to do that? Because he did not want the border states to immediately decide, well, we're going to join up with the South. And in fact, you could argue, viewed in a certain way, that he did not free any slaves, right? Because it wasn't like he said, well, okay, you're emancipated now, and the Southerners were like, oh yeah, our slaves are free now. So basically, now what he did say was that slaves that came to the Union lines should be employed and allowed to sort of participate and help the army. But basically what he wasn't saying was that all slaves everywhere in North America are free. Even given that, the Southerners were not very happy about this idea. This is the text of the Emancipation Proclamation as it was promulgated on the 1st of January, 1863. So by that time, he had decided that by that time the Battle of Antietam had happened in September 17th, yes. I would have said the 20th, but you're right. Of course, being an expert on the Civil War helps. The Battle of Antietam, which rated as a sort of a Union victory, although only in a sort of an odd way. It was a horrifically costly battle. At the time, I think it was the most costly in terms of lives ever fought in North America. But that convinced him that that was the time. I mean, so, and the reason was because that was, and this will become important as we go on, an attempt to invade the North, right? So the Battle of Antietam, it's one of those double-named battles. The Union tended to name battles after geographical locations. And the Southerners tended to name battles after the towns where they happened near. So does anyone, what's the other name for Antietam? Sharpsburg, and that's what the Southerners called it because it was near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. I've often wondered sort of why that was, and it may have been because the Union tended to be in areas that they were less familiar with, so they were like naming them after obvious geographical, but that's just speculation. So now, this is an illustration from a Southern newspaper, and you can get an impression of what the Southerners exactly thought about this. This is King Abraham before and after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Before with his normal human faith, and afterwards he's the devil. The Southerners were not happy about the Emancipation Proclamation. Number one, because, and let's be clear, the Civil War was about slavery. Now, what that does not mean is that all the Northerners were like, hey, let's get rid of slavery. There were many people in the North who thought slavery was a fine idea. Northerners, there were some abolitionists, real abolitionists in the North. There was Wendell Phillips, who thought that Abraham Lincoln was so soft on the question of slavery that he described him as a first-rate, second-rate man. But true abolitionists in the North were in a minority. There were more people in the North who were upset about the fact that the Southerners were insisting that the Northerners enforce the fugitive slave laws. So this was upsetting because, according to the fugitive slave laws, people chasing after slaves could come into a locality in the North and compel the authorities there to help them recover their slaves, or just to grab people who may or may not have been in an enslaved condition before. That happened as well. So there's a sort of an unfortunate kind of revisionist idea that gets going, you'll hear it sometime, that the Civil War was about states' rights. Which is true in a trivial sense. It was about one particular state's right. the right to hold human beings as chattel. And you can tell this if you see Brother Todd's talk about this topic. He is quoted at length from Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech. Alexander Stephens was the Confederate vice president, and he gave a speech in which he was pretty unabashed about what the purpose of their rebellion was. But if you also look at the declarations of secession that the southern states made, you find things like the following in the South Carolina Declaration. Increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. Or from Texas, Texas, was received in the Commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation which her people intended should exist for all future time. And from Georgia, people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to their separation. For the last 10 years, we've had numerous series of causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. So, that's not enough. How about for Mississippi? Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Or Virginia, the federal government having perverted said powers not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. Now, some states, North Carolina was one, Louisiana was another, ironically, because Louisiana was one of the big centers of the slave trade, just said, we're passing this ordinance, like seceding from the country, and didn't explain why. But in those cases, it was mostly because they, I think, thought that everybody understood why they were doing it. I mean, it wasn't one of those things like where we're iffy on the question. So if you had gone to one of the Southerners and told them, like, wow, this isn't about slavery, they would have laughed at you. They knew exactly what it was about. It's only sort of, later on that people came up with this idea that it was about some other topic. Now, militarily, what was going on in the beginning of 1863 was the aftermath of the Battle of Fredericksburg. The Battle of Fredericksburg, the Union had crossed over the Rappahannock, yes. And I'm going to stop looking at you like I know these. Having Todd here is like having a crutch, so I've got to stop. Into Fredericksburg, and then attacked a heavily entrenched Confederate line, first in a sunken road in which Cobb's Georgia Legion and others were awaiting muskets in hand, and then also Marye's Heights behind it. There were something like, I think, 10 charges, none of which managed to breach the Confederate line. Finally, I think this was at Fredericksburg, where one Union officer went to his commander and told him that I would not take my men in there again if Jesus Christ himself were to order the charge. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who we'll talk a little about later, was at the Battle of Fredericksburg, although the 20th Maine was not in the center of the action, but he ended up sort of on the field, clustered up between two dead guys and sort of pulling the flap of one of their coats over him to try and get some sleep. But it was a horrendous defeat for the Union, followed by what's called the Mud March. And this is another of Burnside's sort of great ideas to try and stage a kind of a feint that was going to be associated with the cavalry raid. And it ended up not coming off. And there's not much to say about it except for this. By the third week of January, Lincoln was having corps commanders from the Union Army voicing open complaints about Burnside. And Burnside was a bit ineffectual, but he was not a terrible general, and in fact didn't want to be the commander of the Union forces, had turned down the job twice or maybe 3 times, and finally was sort of prevailed upon by the president to take it after the fall of McClellan. And so Lincoln decided that he had to, that Burnside had lost the confidence of the army. And so he decided to replace him. And the guy he replaced him with was one of his corps commanders, Joseph Hooker. Hooker was often referred to as Fighting Joe, a name that he apparently rather disliked. He had a reputation for sort of brashness and for some other sort of less savory qualities. And Lincoln, when he appointed him on the 26th of January, wrote the following letter to him. And this is, I think, really a masterpiece of Abraham. You really get an insight into the true genius of Abraham Lincoln. Major General Hooker. General, I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course, I have done this upon what appear to me to be sufficient reasons. I think it best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave and a skillful soldier, which, of course, I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable, if not indispensable, quality. You are ambitious, which, within reasonable bounds, does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the army, you have taken counsel of your ambition, and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of this, that I have given you command. Only those generals who gain success can set up as dictators. What I ask of you now is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more or less than it has done, and will do for all commanders. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse in the army, of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him, will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army in which, while such a spirit prevails in it. And now, beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance go forward and give us victories. So this is, and I will risk the dictatorship. I think it's Lincoln's brilliance. He understood what was up with Hooker, and he needed to tell Hooker that he knew that Hooker had agitated against Burnside in the army, and that was not okay, and that the army was in a parlous state because of it, and needed to have its confidence rebuilt. And this Hooker set out to do. He said that his headquarters would be in the saddle, which led some wags to joke that his headquarters were where his hindquarters should be. We're now in the third year of the war. And what's gone from a somewhat amateurish conflict has become much more professionalized. And I wanted to bring up this little vignette, which is one of my sort of favorite illustrations of soldierly life in the Civil War. This is Elisha Hunt Rhodes. At the time that this picture was taken, I believe he was 19. He was a second lieutenant, although the day after what I'm about to describe, he was promoted to first lieutenant. And he ended up, I believe, as a lieutenant colonel. He later was made the head of revenue collection in the state of Rhode Island. But he had joined at 17. He had to get his mother's permission. And he was at many of the major battles in the Eastern Theater. I mean, he's one of those guys who's at so many of these things that it's really surprising that he lived. But they related this in his diary, and I really love this as a sort of vignette. General Thomas J. Jackson, Stonewall, came down to the riverbank. They were stationed on the Rappahannock. The Confederates were on the other side. Came down to the riverbank today with a party of ladies and officers. We raised our hats to the party, and strange to say, the ladies waved their handkerchiefs in reply. Several rebel sentinels told us it was General Jackson. He took his field glasses and coolly surveyed our party. We could have shot him with a revolver. But we have an agreement that neither side will fire, as it does no good, and in fact is simply murder. Now, if you wanted to sum up like soldierly conduct in a way, that to me sums it up. I mean, really, so these guys have been standing around looking at each other across the Rappahannock, which is a pretty wide river at that point, and they've had a chance to sort of talk to each other. I mean, the rebel and Union pickets were constantly talking to each other, telling jokes and telling stories and asking for newspapers, especially the Southerners, which the Northerners were not allowed to give them, but they wanted to find out what was going on in the wide world. And what they discovered as they talked to each other was that they were all very similar. They had a common stock of experiences. They were all mostly from farms or small towns. You know, most of them had never been further than 20 miles away from the spot where they were born. If you look at the Southern soldier, a very small number of them had any real connection to slaveholding, right? So what you have is these guys who talk to each other and understand each other, have a sort of sense of understanding in a way that they know that they're opponents, right? And they know that there's a point at which they're going to have to shoot at each other and try and kill each other. But the point is, there's no point in doing it now. There's no point in taking pot shots at each other across the Rappahannock. What good is that going to do? That's just going to be killing people for the sake of killing them. And there's no point in it. And I really think that sums up a lot about the soldiers in the Civil War, the common soldiers, and the way, the sort of mindset they had gotten into 2 years into this war. Hooker did a lot to sort of rejuvenate the Army, to bring better organization, better discipline. And then he marched into Virginia. There's an area in central Virginia, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, which is a sort of area, heavily forested area around there, Spotsylvania, where 4 or 5 incredibly violent battles take place in 1863 and 64. Chancellorsville, you can see Fredericksburg is here. What Hooker wants to do is sort of outflank Lee, because at this point, the Union Army is still focused on trying to capture Richmond. Now, later on, when Grant gets into command, Grant's real brilliancy, if you want to understand it that way, is that there's no point in capturing Richmond. What you have to do is destroy the Confederate armies. Like, if you capturing Richmond does very little good. But at this point, the Union Army and Hooker in its leadership was still trying to outflank Lee. So Hooker has Sedgwick once again attacking on the line where they had unsuccessfully tried to attack Fredericksburg. This is the Rappahannock River. This is Marye's Heights, where the Union Army had come to grief in December, and tries to move around by the by the right flank. Chancellorsville, which took place in a sort of a clearing in the Wilderness, the next year there would be another even more horrific battle, just called the Wilderness, in almost the same place. As a matter of fact, soldiers fighting in the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864 would often find the bleached bones of people who'd been killed in the previous battle just lying about. But it's viewed as Lee's great brilliancy. And it's one of the few times that all of Lee's ideas really came off. By and large, Lee was tactically, arguably, the greatest commander that American military science ever produced. But he had a hard time getting his subordinates to show up at the right place at the right time, especially Jackson. There's one of these times, just for the spitefulness maybe, because we're Northerners here, well, I think we should just do a program on Jackson, debunking Jackson, which we won't do now for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. But Jackson was, okay, I'm just going to let that lie. So Lee divides his force, and practically the first thing they teach you in military science is don't divide your force in the presence of a superior enemy, because what is likely to happen if you do is that enemy will then fix one of your bits and destroy the other one, and then destroy the first one. But so Lee divides his forces between Early over here by Fredericksburg and the rest of his forces over here, and then he sends Stuart riding all the way around to where Hooker has left his right flank out in the air. Normally, and this will come as no surprise to any of you who follow military affairs, you need to have your flanks anchored on something to prevent someone from doing what the Confederates did right here. And all of a sudden, what you get is Stuart attacking the Union line end on, basically. And by the way, I won't get deeply into this, but I was reading online, there's a big presentation online, you can find it if you try, of a guy like defending Hooker for Chancellorsville, which is almost anybody will, there's no commander so incompetent that somebody won't try to defend him. And part of the problem was that Hooker was standing against a pillar in the mansion where the Union command center was, the Union headquarters was, and a cannonball hit the post and nearly knocked him unconscious for several hours, actually. And then when he sort of came to, he wouldn't relinquish command. And he swore ever afterward that he hadn't been in any way incapacitated, which is probably true. He just had his dispositions were just bad. Later, he was reputed to have said to a reporter, "Well, I just lost confidence in Joe Hooker," but that's been debunked. I think. I don't think he really ever said that. So the Union forces are forced to retreat. And then we get to what may be one of the most key moments in the war. Because Lee has realized that if they're going to win, what he needs to do is invade the North. They had tried to do it in September of 1862 when they went up into Maryland. They had been repulsed at Antietam. Then Lee comes up with this plan wherein they're going to invade Pennsylvania. And by doing so, they're going to take the war to the Union. Hopefully by doing so, I mean, they hope to sort of inflict military defeats, but they also hope to power up pacifist sentiment or anti-war sentiment in the North, right? Because by and large, and by and large I mean almost exclusively, between 1861 and now, this war has been fought in Southern territory. And it's going to get fought a lot more in Southern territory in 1864 when Sherman goes through the South. I will just say, too, and then I will get back to serious talk, people sort of looking at the Civil War from a sort of Southern perspective often complain about Sherman. Sherman, if you look at the long scope of military history and what tends to happen to people doing rebellions, Sherman was a pretty soft touch relative to some other things. I mean, it wasn't the Athenians in Mytilene killing every 10th man. I mean, it was so, you know, and if you don't want to have that happen, maybe a treasonous rebellion is not the appropriate choice. But what do I know? Well, of that I have no doubt. I went to library school at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and certainly would not fly there either. But one thing that does happen in the Battle of Chancellorsville is that Jackson and some of his lieutenants were considering a night attack to try and press the Confederate victory. And as he returned to his lines, he was shot by his own pickets. He was shot through the left arm. And this is a mini ball, is a big old bullet. And if it goes through you, chances are where that place where it went through you, all that bone is gone. Which is why there were so many amputations in the Civil War. A high velocity, you know, like a 227 won't, I mean, it will mess you up, but it won't do that to you. And also medical science was not at a very high ebb, as evidenced by the fact that good old James A. Garfield died, not so much because he was shot, but because the doctor working on him thought that the germ theory was a passing European fad. Jackson was, not to make light of it, but that's really what happened. Jackson was taken to a house. His arm was amputated. I believe he died of pneumonia. He became increasingly ill for several days. This is the house in which he spent his last days, and he was sort of slipping in and out of lucidity. The doctor asked him if he wanted morphine, and he turned it down. He said he wanted to keep his mind clear. And then as he was quiet for a while, and then he opened his eyes and he said, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." And he died, which is a very beautiful sentiment in that moment from a guy who I otherwise think was somewhat pernicious. But it's bad form to speak ill of the dead. So, but it's one of those things too. You know, if you read a lot of Civil War history, and I'm sure most of you in this room have read a fair amount, like, there was a kind of lyricality to the way people spoke back then that we've a little bit lost in the way that we speak English now, which is unfortunate. Todd and I were talking as we were putting this together about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And if you read The Passing of the Armies, Chamberlain's somewhat overwrought book about his experiences in the Civil War, it's not bad, it's just overly flowery. Some passages in it are very powerful. Some of them, you're just like, dude, you really did need an editor for this. This is a very complicated map of Lee's march. So you got to kind of move at angles. Those of you who are familiar with the geography of Pennsylvania, it's kind of like ridges that go from sort of northeast to southwest. They move into Pennsylvania. Hooker by this time has been replaced by George Meade, a general whose subordinate once referred to him as a damned goggle-eyed old snapping turtle. But so Meade is sort of shadowing him, and you can kind of see Meade has this idea that there's a creek in Maryland called Pipe Creek, and what Meade wants to do is they're going to set up a defensive line on Pipe Creek. And he keeps telling his guys, okay, so like eventually the Confederates, we got to get them into this, prepare this defense, Pipe Creek. So if you read the sort of dispatches surrounding the invasion of Pennsylvania, the Pipe Creek line comes up over and over, and Meade is sort of waiting there. We're going to fight it out at Pipe Creek. The Confederates end up heading for Gettysburg, and there's a sort of a story about there being a trainload of shoes there. I think that's been debunked. I'm not sure. I don't think it's true. But the reason they really wanted to go there was because it was a crossroads town. If you look at the map of Gettysburg, there's 5 major roads that all meet at Gettysburg. And that's the kind of place that an army wants to go because it gives them a lot. Armies don't like marching over land. They like marching on roads. It's a lot more efficient. So what you want to do is find these crossroads because that gives you more options of which direction you're going to go. While this is happening, Jeb Stuart, Lee's cavalry commander, had just been involved in a cavalry engagement in which he had lost or not come out ahead. And he was a little embarrassed. He had earlier staged a kind of ride where he rode around the whole Union Army. And Lincoln was very annoyed by this. Lincoln finally said, we had a game back in Illinois called Third Time and Out. And if Stuart does this again, I'm firing all my cavalry commanders. But so Stuart contrives to ride all the way around the Union Army, which has unfortunate consequences because, as those of you who follow military affairs will know, what a cavalry commander is supposed to do, what a cavalry officer is supposed to do, what cavalry is supposed to do, is tell you where the enemy is. And so Lee was out of touch with Stuart for several days while this is going on. This is Stuart in Chambersburg. He ends up riding up to Carlisle up here, where there's a barracks that he had actually served at. And he rolls up on Carlisle. Carlisle is defended by several hundred militiamen and a few other cadets and people like that. And there's a Union general whose name I never sticks in my head. But it's worth reading this history because Stuart sort of wants to take the town, right? Stuart's just, reading his own press clippings. So he kind of invests the town, and he sends a note into the commander, and he says, well, I think you should surrender, or I'm going to shell the town. And to which the Union general said, shell away and be damned. He wasn't going to give up the town just because Stuart asked him to. And so Stuart opened fire on the town. Here's a lithograph of it happening. You can see people running back and forth. Stuart was not totally happy about this. He had been stationed at Carlisle Barracks when he was a young trooper, and he rather liked Carlisle. But he also thought that, it was he was trying to sort of get stuff. So they shell the town. They hit the gasworks, which explodes quite spectacularly. Then he sends another note into the Union general commanding, and the courier comes in and says, General, my commander would like to meet with you to parley, to which the Union commander sent back a note saying, I would suggest that you tell your commander that I would sooner meet him in a much warmer place. And once again, I love Civil War era. I mean, he doesn't just say, well, go to hell, tell your commander to go to hell. He said, I would sooner meet him in a much warmer place. What a much nicer way of expressing that sentiment. On July 1st, the Confederate Lee's army, the sort of advanced elements, advanced down the Chambersburg Pike, coming in from the northwest toward Gettysburg, and they run into John Buford's cavalry. They had been told, Lee's troops had been, the Confederates had been told, not to get into a major engagement there. Here's a painting, this is a kind of later representation, but you can see Buford, who is a pretty hard-nosed guy, who decided that they needed to make a stand there until the Union could get its troops brought up. So he has just, I think, about 2,200 cavalry troopers, not that many. And you think about cavalry, if they're going to stand and fight, is you need every third guy back in the back holding the horses. But what he does is, so this is Buford on the Chambersburg Pike with his troopers, looking down the Chambersburg Pike, and you can sort of see that the Confederates on the way. So he sets up lines of defense on her ridge and then on McPherson's ridge. And what he figures he's going to do is he's going to trade space for time, right? So they're going to fight. They're going to drop back. They had prepared positions to drop back to. And so this is McPherson's barn. It's been reconstructed or renovated. In fact, I think the McPherson farm burned in 1895, and that's, I think, the only building that's left. It looks much nicer now. This is a reunion of the 149th Pennsylvania Volunteers, and you can see McPherson's barn in the back. It's a bit more ramshackle in that picture than it later came to be. But you can get a sort of idea of this is the kind of territory these guys are fighting on. So eventually, the Union line ends up in a kind of a long fishhook on Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, down to the Round Tops. Round Top. People sometimes call it Big Round Top. I think it's just called Round Top. And the smaller one was called Little Round Top. I keep looking over at Todd, like when I say things like this, thinking he's going to be like, no. Try again, Sparky. But Confederates are aligned along Seminary Ridge, and then there's the town in the middle. On the second day, you get a couple of things happening. One, remember I was talking about people like defense of incompetent commanders. You get Dan Sickles, who's been told to hold his position here. Sickles was a political general from New York. I think he was a Tammany Hall politician who had gained fame for shooting his wife's lover dead on the street in New York City. And he decided that although these ridges were a great place to be, an even better place to be would be the Emmitsburg Road, out on the flat area between the two ridges on which the armies were arrayed. So he marched out there, and Winfield Scott Hancock, the Corps commander, was looking down, and somebody, he looked at him and they said, well, just keep watching because he'll come tumbling back shortly. And that's essentially what happened, although it was a much more bloodier tumbling back than most of the people with him would have preferred. He was attacked repeatedly, pushed back through Sherfy's Peach Orchard, through the wheat field, into the Plum Run Valley, to the base of Little Round Top where the Devil's Den is. And Longstreet said afterward that he thought that, in fact, they had expended so much energy trying to push him back that in a way it worked tactically, although Sickles had no business going out where he was, and also managed to get nearly killed by an exploding shell which blew off one of his legs. But Sickles spent the rest of his life, which was quite long, I think he lived in the beginning of the 20th century, defending himself for having done this. One of the consequences of this was that there was a kind of a wild rolling battle through this valley in between. And at one point, about 7 o'clock, a gap opened up in the Union line. And the Union commander who was there, who I think again was Hancock, went up to the first group of troops that he saw, and he said, "Who are you guys?" And they said, "We're the 1st Minnesota Volunteers." And he said, "I need you to charge and take that Confederate flag. This is right here. Here's the 1st Minnesota, charging 4 regiments of Confederates, probably 1,500 men or slightly more. At this point, there were, I believe, 256 soldiers to start out with in the 1st Minnesota Volunteers. But they formed up and they charged right then. And they managed, this is a later rendition of it, but it's, I think, one of the most compelling images I've ever seen painted of the Civil War, of the lumberjacks from the 1st Minnesota Volunteers charging into a group of about 1,500 guys. And they knocked them back. And then they were forced to retreat, and I think at the end of the day, there were only 46 of these guys left. I think they took this was the highest casualties of any Union regiment in the war. And it's a really singular moment of courage just to say, okay, General says we got to go. After the war, Hancock was asked if he regretted ordering the charge, and he said, no, I would have ordered that charge if I'd have known that all of them were going to be killed. He needed to buy that time. It bought him 15 or 20 minutes, by which time he could get more troops in to hold the line. And what ultimately happens is then you get the next day, that's Sherfy's Peach Orchard, by the way, in case you've ever wondered what that looked like. You get, at the end of the day, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's moment on Little Round Top, which was pumped up in history to a great extent by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain himself. And not to say that this wasn't a courageous moment, but Chamberlain spent the rest of his long life building it up, and then, of course, it was worked into the Shara book, and then it was also in the movie. People have later said, well, the position wasn't necessarily that important. There was a whole Union Corps behind that ridge, so it wasn't like the Confederates were going to roll them up. But they didn't know that. The guys in the 20th Maine 100% didn't know that. As far as they knew, they were the end of the Union line. So if they get turned, that's it, right? So, and then finally, and then I'm going to get out of the way, A, because I've gone on kind of long, and B, because I'm talking about the Civil War, about the Battle of Gettysburg in front of a guy who used to be the ranger at Gettysburg. This is Pickett's charge. You can see the Confederates coming across the valley here. You can see Hancock on his horse. This is true to life. He rode around urging on the Union soldiers. His subordinates said, "General, you need to get off. You get your head down." And he said, "There are times when a corps commander's life doesn't count." Well, that's true. But he was doing his best to lead the guys and to be around for them. Pickett's men return after the failed charge. Lee goes out to meet them on the field and says, "This has all been my fault." And that's the high water mark of the Confederate invasion into the North. The Confederates never managed to go into the North. It's argued that a lot of Lee's best troops died on that day in what was a pretty ill-conceived charge, unfortunately, although Lee was a very canny and effective commander mostly. On that day he made a catastrophic blunder. And the South was probably never going to win the war just based on the North's superior industrial base and the fact that the North had a lot more people. But after that day, they were certainly not going to win. Okay, I've gone on. But now, so this takes place July 3rd, 1863. And what I've talked about is sort of what was going on in the East, and now my colleague here is going to talk about what went on in the West.
I give you a B+ for Gettysburg. How's that?
I think that's fair.
Just kidding.
I think that it's tough but fair.
All right. So, hi everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for being here tonight. As you see, I'm Todd Arrington. I'm the site manager down at James A. Garfield National Historic Site. Yes, I did live in Gettysburg. I did work there. But I am actually here to talk to you tonight about what's going on in the Western theater of the Civil War for the first half or so of 1863. It would be way too easy for me to take the East because, of course, I know all about that because I lived and breathed it for so long. Just kidding, of course. I'm just giving John a hard time. And then when you come back here in November, because obviously you are all coming back, you didn't know you were obligated to come back to the second part of this program in November, we'll kind of flip around. We'll do the second half of 1863, and I'll do the East, and John will do the West. So you'll get kind of both of our perspectives on both areas at one time or another. But like John, I actually am going to start before 1863, just to give you just a little bit of background on what's going on. And as I said, I grew up in the East. I lived in Gettysburg. I worked there long, long ago. So I am somebody who came from the idea, the perspective that the Eastern theater is what really mattered. Washington and Richmond are in the East. Gettysburg's in the East. Antietam's in the East. You know, all of these majorly important battles. But I have to say, over time, I have actually come to maybe start to waver on that a little bit and feel like, you know, the war really is won in the West. A lot of the greatest Union commanders who eventually win the war, Grant, Sherman, James Garfield, of course, they're all fighting in the Western theater. So you know, while we think about the Union having terrible, terrible times in this war for the first couple of years, that is the case in the Eastern theater. The Union is seeing success in the West pretty early on in the war, and that's because of guys like Grant and Sherman. So, you know, I have come around at least to believe that, you know, the Western theater is actually perhaps the most critical theater, certainly on an even par with the Eastern theater. So again, I have to start a little bit early as well. I'm going all the way back to 1820, so get comfortable because you'll be here for like the next 4 hours. Just kidding, of course. But just to sort of give you an idea of why I think that, you know, the Civil War really is a conflict about the West. Now, yes, a lot of it happens in the East, clearly, but what the war is really all about, of course, as John mentioned, is, you know, the root cause of the war is slavery. But it's not just the existence of slavery, it's the potential expansion of slavery into the West. So really what I'm going to be showing you here are all things that are related to what was going on in the West, both before the war and also during the war. I'll quickly go through all this just to, again, sort of give you a little bit of information about the West. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820 is really where a lot of this sectional conflict about slavery began. You could really say it goes all the way back to the Constitution. But if I started it at 1787, we'd be here until tomorrow morning, and I want to keep you that long. So we'll start with 1820. So by 1820, the country had kind of an unofficial agreement that there would always be an equal number of slave states and free states. So, and that basically held for several decades, that, you know, anytime a new free state wanted to come in, a new slave state had to come in too. Or anytime a new slave state wanted to come in, a new free state had to come in, because they're trying to keep a balance of power in the Congress. And of course, everybody knows every state has 2 senators, but House of Representative seats, the lower house, is determined by population. So they're trying to keep an equal number of slave and free states so that the representation of each section in the House is fairly equal. This all gets blown up in 1820, though, when Missouri in the West decides it wants to enter the Union as a slave state. And there is no, at this point, corresponding free state that is ready to come into the Union as well. So what the Missouri Compromise did was it did 2 things. It created a brand new state up here called Maine. They hacked off part of Massachusetts and said, we'll call this Maine, and we'll bring that in at the same time as Missouri. But more importantly, the Missouri Compromise creates a geographic border, a geographic line above which, you maybe remember this from your high school history classes or college history classes, the 3630 line. Above that line, no slavery is permitted. Below that line, slavery is permitted. Now, of course, what's the one exception to that rule? It is, in fact, the actual state of Missouri. So Missouri comes in as a slave state. It is above its own line, but nothing else above that 3630 line is going to be able to have slavery. And that holds for the next 30 years. I mean, there's plenty of conflict, but it holds until 1854. And what happens in 1854 is some of these areas here in this what's labeled unorganized territory on this map decide that it's time for them to come into the Union as well, primarily as territories, really. And the 2 territories are Kansas and Nebraska. And if you look on a map, look on this map, you can tell where Kansas and Nebraska are supposed to be. And a very otherwise pretty smart guy named Stephen Douglas, who's a senator from the state of Illinois, a Democratic senator from Illinois, when he introduces this legislation to bring Kansas and Nebraska in and to organize them politically into territorial governments, he says that Kansas and Nebraska should have what's called popular sovereignty about slavery, meaning the people who live there should be allowed to vote on whether or not they want to be slave territories or free territories, which sounds great. This is America. We love democracy. We want to put things to a vote, right? That sounds great. The only problem is Kansas and Nebraska are both north of the 3630 line. So you have some very smart people looking at this saying, wait a minute, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, if it is signed into law, repeals the Missouri Compromise. And now suddenly everything in here is open to slavery as long as the people living there vote for it. So guys like Abraham Lincoln, who is out of politics at this point, is doing very well for himself as a lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, suddenly is drawn back into being very passionate about politics and feeling like he has a role to play because the Kansas-Nebraska Act in effect repeals the Missouri Compromise. And the Republican Party is founded the very same year, 1854, in direct response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So, Abraham Lincoln starts his political career as a Whig. The Whig Party by this time is pretty ineffectual and is kind of dying anyway. But the final nail in the coffin for the Whigs was they could not come up with any kind of cohesive response to slavery, to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, to the potential expansion of slavery into the Western territories. And so a new party rises from the ashes of the old Whig Party, and that's the Republican Party. The Republicans some of them were abolitionists, some of them were, landowners in the North who really didn't, frankly, care all that much about slavery, other than the fact that they didn't want it expanding to the West. So there was this sort of amalgam of people that made up the early Republican Party, but the Republican Party is created in direct response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then finally, the Dred Scott decision of 1857. This is Dred Scott right up here. He was an enslaved man who had been owned by a family and carried into many, many free states and territories. The owner was an army surgeon, and so they, went to all these different places. Dred Scott eventually sued for his freedom, saying, I should have been a free man as soon as I stepped foot in a free territory. And so he sued, and his original case was heard in St. Louis in the old courthouse, which is now part of Gateway Arch National Historic Park, or National Park, excuse me, if you ever go out there to the St. Louis Arch. The old courthouse is part of that park. But at any rate, it wound its way through the courts for a very long time. And just like today, it takes a very long time for something to make it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But finally, by 1857, Scott, of course, kept losing, kept appealing, and the case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. The majority decision was written by Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was from Maryland, and he was a slave owner. And he wrote a very long decision explaining why Scott was not entitled to be free and why, in fact, Congress really didn't even have the authority to determine which territories could be free or slave anyway. But this is the most famous line where he's talking about enslaved people, about black people. They, meaning black people, had been, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So, in this case, what Taney has said is Congress has no authority to legislate where slavery does or does not exist, and oh, by the way, black people have absolutely no claim to citizenship. They are only to be enslaved. That is why they are here. And that's the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, by the way. So then we get to 1860, and of course that's the year that Abraham Lincoln is the Republican nominee for president. The first quote there is actually from the letter he wrote in 1858 accepting, the speech he gave, I said letter, I meant speech, accepting the Republican nomination to run for the U.S. Senate from Illinois against none other than Stephen Douglas, the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is a very famous quote. You've all heard it. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. So that's 1858. Needless to say, has anyone here ever heard of Senator Abraham Lincoln? No, you have not, because he lost. He lost that election. What he got out of that election was something much more valuable than a Senate seat, believe it or not, which is he got national exposure as somebody that was a very articulate anti-slavery voice. Was Lincoln himself an abolitionist? No, he was not. Lincoln was of the opinion, and which was a very informed opinion, that the United States has no constitutional authority to go into states where slavery already exists and get rid of it. The United States, in his view, despite what Roger Taney had to say in the Dred Scott decision, the United States does have the authority to determine whether or not slavery can go into the territories, because the territories are federal property. So you can't go into a sovereign state like Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia and say, no more slavery here. You can go into a territory which the federal government owns and is federal government property and is under federal jurisdiction and say, there will not be slavery here. Especially if you've already got a geographic line where you said 30-some years ago, no slavery can be above here anyway. So that's where Lincoln is coming from. He's not an abolitionist, as John said in the other presentation. He says some things that would make us cringe today, which were very commonly used, phrases in that era. But he is not somebody who thinks that slavery should be able to expand to the territories. And there is no question, based on his writings all the way back to when he was a young man, he found slavery personally abhorrent, but he did not see any legal way to get rid of it in the states where it already existed. Now, this is really interesting here. This is a letter Lincoln wrote in December of 1860, after he was already president-elect. He'd won the election. And the person that he wrote this letter to, John mentioned, was Alexander Stephens. So Lincoln had served one term in the House of Representatives back in the 1840s. So he knew Alexander Stephens, who was also in the House of Representatives at that time representing the state of Georgia. So they knew each other. And Lincoln here is reaching out to Stephens as president-elect of the United States, as states are starting to rattle their sabers about seceding. He's reaching out to the guy who eventually becomes the vice president of the Confederacy. And he's saying, do the people of the South really entertain fears that a Republican administration would directly or indirectly interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves? If they do, I wish to assure you, as once a friend and still I hope not an enemy, that there is no cause for such fears. Remember what I just said. Legally, constitutionally, the U.S. government cannot go into Georgia and tell Alexander Stephens, you can't have slaves in Georgia anymore. The South would be in no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. I suppose, however, this does not meet the case. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. Not abolished, restricted. Not able to expand into the territories. You think, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted, that, I suppose, is the rub. It certainly is the only substantial difference between us. That's the president-elect of the United States telling a very prominent Southerner, we have no quarrel with you about the existence of slavery. We only want to keep it from expanding. So I'm going backwards here a little bit just to show you the 1860 presidential election. The red states are the ones won by Lincoln. As you can see, he won nothing in the South. In fact, in many of the southern states, he wasn't even on the ballot. He had no opportunity to get votes in the South. Had he had that opportunity, he probably would have gotten very few. But yes, there probably were at least a few people in pockets of the South that would have voted for him had he been on the ballot. The other interesting thing about this election in 1860 is that it was almost guaranteed that Lincoln was going to win because the Democratic Party was so split. They had two different candidates from the Democratic Party. They had the Northern Democrat, who was Stephen Douglas, our old friend from Illinois. And then they had a Southern Democrat who was John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky, who was the sitting vice president of the United States under President James Buchanan. Breckinridge was a slave owner and eventually became a Confederate general during the Civil War. So the Democrats split. That's never a good sign for your party. And then throw in what we would call today a third party, although in this case it's really a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, which ran a guy named John C. Bell, who was from Tennessee, and their platform was basically, let's just keep everything the way it is. So Bell actually won more states than Douglas. But at any rate, Lincoln wins. Of course, all the Republicans vote for Lincoln. The Democrats are split. And so it's guaranteed that even though Lincoln gets only about 40% of the popular vote, he wins handily in the Electoral College. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected as the 16th president of the United States. John mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation at the beginning. Obviously that's something that Lincoln initially announced in September of 1862 after the victory at Antietam, as John talked about, became effective on January 1st, 1863. And again, since I'm up here talking to you about what's going on in the West, I will emphasize that there were exemptions, as John mentioned. One of those was Missouri, which was one of the border states. Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky were the four border states. Missouri is the only one of those that's really considered a Western state. So I'll mention that just because we're talking about the West now. Lincoln himself, of course, was a Westerner. Born in Kentucky, yes, born in the South, but lived in Indiana for a time as a young man, and then, of course, primarily associated with Illinois. So he's a Westerner himself. And then here's the real question. If we say slavery is the root cause of the Civil War, which it is it the existence of slavery, or is it the potential expansion of slavery that people are really concerned about? There are plenty of people out there who call themselves abolitionists at this point who are vehemently opposed to slavery, whether it's on religious grounds or whatever the case may be. They do not feel that anyone should be enslaved. It's criminal, it's illegal, it's immoral. There are also those in the North who, as I said, don't frankly care that much about this issue other than they don't want slavery expanding into the West. And then there are others in the North who, just probably aren't paying attention at all and don't give it a second thought. But really, ultimately, despite what Southerners decided to think or what Southern leaders decided to tell their populations or their constituents, Abraham Lincoln did not run in 1860 on a platform that said, okay, if I win, we're going to invade the South and abolish slavery. Absolutely not. He ran on what I just showed you, what he said to Alexander Stephens, which is preventing the expansion of slavery into the territories. So, did the Southerners kind of shoot themselves in the foot by seceding and all this? They probably did. Had they but they were so enraged and they were so worked up into a fury by some of their elected officials, by some of their newspapers, that, you know, every Republican was what they called a damned black Republican, and every Republican was an abolitionist, and if a Republican becomes president, they're coming for your slaves. We've got to secede. It's our only option to save our way of life, which of course includes slavery. But ultimately, it's the expansion of slavery, not the existence of slavery, that really is the tipping point for the Civil War. And of course, the other thing to mention about the Emancipation Proclamation, and maybe John did mention this, is that in addition to making abolition of slavery part of the Union's war effort, you know, as of January 1st, 1863, if the Union wins the war, slavery is dead. Now, how can Lincoln say that when he's spent, you know, decades of his life saying we have no constitutional means to interfere with slavery? Well, you can do things a lot differently in the midst of a rebellion, an insurrection, a civil war, whatever you want to call it. There are a number of expanded powers for the executive branch in that case. And in this case, you know, the country was at war. And oh, by the way, did Southerners really look, as John said, you know, did the Southerners wake up on January 1st and go, oh man, now we got to release all the slaves? Of course not, because they considered themselves a foreign country. They considered Lincoln a foreign, hostile president. But ultimately, the Emancipation Proclamation not only makes abolition of slavery part of what the Union is now fighting for, but it also gives the Union the mechanism by which they can recruit black men to fight. And by the time the Civil War ended, nearly 200,000 black men had done so. So that was a huge influx of manpower that the Union very much needed and was very, very integral to winning the war. Now, this is something maybe you don't think about so much with the Civil War, the Homestead Act. And again, I'm reaching back into my own past here because the first 10 years of my Park Service career were spent at a park that dealt with the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act went into effect the very same day as the Emancipation Proclamation. The Homestead Act opened millions of acres of public domain in the West to settlement. People could go out there, and if they met all the requirements, they were able to claim up to 160 acres of land. It was the land itself was really free. There were, you know, some filing fees and things like that, but the land itself was free. You had to live on it, you had to cultivate it, and if at the end of 5 years you had met all the requirements, it was yours. You got title to that land. So the federal government used this as a way to get people out into the West. It lasted for 123 years. It was in effect until the 1980s, if you can believe that. 270 million acres of land distributed. It was quite progressive for its era in that single women, who in many places could not own anything in their own names, they were the property of their husbands. I can assure you that that doesn't work anymore. That is definitely not the case anymore. Well, yeah, you could say that in a way that at least legally they had, you know, they didn't always have a lot of rights. But under the Homestead Act, women could own land, single women could own land in their own names. And then after the Civil War, the war was over, the Reconstruction Amendments of the Constitution were passed, black families could homestead too. So it was fairly progressive. And then they slipped this is my favorite line in the whole thing, is applicant for a homestead must never have borne arms against the United States government or given aid and comfort to its enemies. So you don't see a lot of Southerners heading out to Nebraska or Kansas after the Civil War to claim homesteads because they're not eligible to do so. So this is a really important piece of legislation in and of itself, and we could talk for hours about the great things that it did for people and the negatives. You know, it had some devastating environmental consequences. Obviously, it was just one more thing that was heartbreaking and sad for American Indian populations. But for the purposes of this program, what I propose to you is that this is one piece of a very strategic puzzle that Northern politicians are putting together during the Civil War. They pass all kinds of pieces of legislation that they had tried to pass before the war and that Southern Democrats would never let get through the Congress because they didn't want anybody going out to these places unless they knew slavery could go with it. They didn't want a transcontinental railroad unless they knew it was going to run through the South. So the Northern politicians were very sly and savvy here in that they waited until all the Southerners had seceded and left Congress, and they passed just this flurry of bills. That the Homestead Act, they created the Department of Agriculture, they created the Transcontinental Railroad, the Morrill Act, which is creation of land-grant colleges. They were shaping the future of the West so that even if the Union lost the war, it still would have been very hard for Southerners to migrate to the West and to take slavery with them because there would have already been homesteaders, there would have already been towns established by the railroads, there would have already been a lot of Northerners living out there. So this is my term, it's a 19th century New Deal. Maybe that's a little overwrought, I don't know, but nothing wrong with being a little controversial here. So that's the Homestead Act, January 1st, 1860, same day as the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't have a lot for you on really, there's so many battles going on in the West, but I think it bears mentioning any time that we can reinforce the idea that getting the Confederacy cut off from the Mississippi River was a huge strategic goal of the Union in the West. So the Battle of Arkansas Post, which again is not a battle that is, many people know much about, including me, quite frankly, takes place between January 9th and 11th, 1863. This is General John McClernand, Admiral David Dixon Porter, both Union. And here's Arkansas Post right here. So Arkansas Post is a major Confederate stronghold on the Arkansas River, but the most important part of this map is not in Arkansas, it's right here, and of course that's the Mississippi River. So the Arkansas flows right towards the Mississippi. So by denying this area to the Confederacy, the Union is taking one more step to denying the Confederacy access to the Mississippi. That is a huge strategic goal for the Union in the West, really for the entire war, but especially here as we move into 1863. It's just one more way that the Union is really denying the Mississippi River to the Confederacy. So I got a couple of these in here too. I mentioned this only, Arizona Territory is approved as a territory on February 24th, 1863. I mentioned this really for two reasons, I guess. One, to show you that the business of government still has to go on even during a civil war. And during this period, there were plenty of areas in the West that were trying to get territorial status. But I think the second thing that's important here, too, is that Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans who were running the federal government at this point, they were thrilled to get new territories authorized because territories eventually become states. And more states means more northern-minded people or more Republicans going to Washington, D.C. to sit in the Congress. So you see several territories and a state, too, come in during the Civil War. That's why they're doing that. They're trying to create more territories because they're trying to create more northern states. I realize Arizona is not in the north, but of course it's going to be populated by people coming from the north. So Arizona Territory is authorized on February 24th, 1863. Another part of this sort of 19th century New Deal, if you will, or just revolutionizing of the federal government and making it more into the federal government that we know today is the National Banking Act of February 25th, 1863. So prior to the Civil War, if you study Revolutionary era history, you hear this all the time about all the states had different currency. You could go from Pennsylvania to New York and not be able to use your money because you had Pennsylvania money, not New York money. A lot of that, believe it or not, is still going on at this point. There was a period during Andrew Jackson's presidency and prior to that when there was this thing called the Bank of the United States. It was kind of an attempt to centralize banking and centralize currency and get everybody on the same system. And Andrew Jackson was vehemently opposed to banks and to bankers, and so he kind of destroyed the Bank of the United States when he was president because he didn't think it was a good or a fair system. So there are several objectives here with the National Banking Act of February 25th, 1863. Create a market for war bonds, which of course helps raise money to fight the war. I've been rewatching on Netflix, they now have Band of Brothers and The Pacific. And I was just watching the Pacific last night, and there's an episode where a guy who has received the Medal of Honor is sent home to help to help sell war bonds for the war effort. So this, I mean, that's the 1940s here. 1960s, and so some of those things were still going on 80 years later. So create a market for war bonds, reestablish that central banking system that went by the wayside during Jackson's administration in the 1830s, and then develop a stable banknote currency. If you know, prior to the Civil War, paper money was not nearly as popular as, of course, it's, you know, that's what we have today. During the Civil War is when we first saw paper money that was sort of universal, at least for the northern states. Confederate states had their own money too. And they used green ink on that. That's why they started to be called greenbacks. So if I had any money on me, I'd show you, but I don't because I work for the Park Service. So, but that's where you get the term greenback. It's from that paper money that became very popular during the Civil War. And then after the war, it became which is not what we're talking about here, but it became quite a major debate about, do we keep greenbacks? Do we pull them out of circulation? What about the gold standard? You know, there were plenty of people, including James Garfield, in fact, who were very dedicated to hard money. They wanted, specie, they called it. They didn't like paper money. They understood the need for it during the war, but once the war was over, they wanted to go back to hard, money that was backed by gold. And of course, we haven't been on the gold standard now in decades, but anyway. So, what is it that backs the money that we all carry in our pockets? It's the good name and credit of the United States of America. So, it's basically like, hey, just trust us. That's cool. That's really what it is. Not to get into politics, but you see, like, the whole thing last week about the shutdown, the amount of money that this government not only generates but spends. It's kind of amazing to think that, that's all that's backing this up is the good name and credit of the United States. And that's why we never want to default on our debt, or we never want to see the country's credit rating go lower, because that affects the value of the money in our pockets. And these are arguments that were being had even during the Civil War. So I'm not, I'm obviously coming at this from a historian's perspective, not a citizen who doesn't have any money in his pocket right now. So. All right, again, just one more of these territories to mention. So Idaho Territory, just not too long after Arizona. Idaho is approved as a territory. This map's a little blurry, I realize, but you can see kind of the outline here of Idaho. But what's funny about Idaho here is you don't see Montana, you don't see Wyoming, and that's because it was all Idaho Territory at one point. So this is a huge territory. And here's Dakota Territory, which of course didn't become North Dakota and South Dakota until 1889, I think it was. So anyway, Idaho is another territory that, hey, let's get as many of these territories in here. They'll eventually become states, and they'll send members to Congress who think like us. All right, so again, keeping our eyes on the West here, we have the beginning of, in April of '63, the beginning of Ulysses S. Grant's Spring Offensive. And the overall objective, as I've already said, is take Vicksburg, which is kind of the key to the Mississippi River. If the if the Union rather can take Vicksburg, they basically deny access to the Mississippi River, which is hugely important for commerce, for moving troops on ships, that kind of thing. The Mississippi River is the lifeline of the Confederacy. And so recognizing that, Grant says, we need to make sure they have no access to the Mississippi River. So on April 30th, he embarks about 23,000 Union troops from barges near Bruinsburg, Mississippi. I have to check on this. This seems a little, the largest U.S. amphibious offensive until D-Day. I don't know. There were sure plenty of, guys island hopping in the Pacific that I thought maybe had more than 23,000 troops landing, but maybe I'm wrong. So I meant to check on that, and then I forgot to do it, so I apologize. But at any rate, that's really the beginning of Grant's Spring Offensive. And then as you can see, there are all these victories for Union forces as they start moving closer and closer to Vicksburg. So Union forces are pushing in, Confederate forces continue to pull back towards Vicksburg. And they eventually are pushed into Vicksburg, and they take refuge in the town, and there's nowhere else they can go because literally what's behind Vicksburg? The river. So once you've hit Vicksburg, unless you're planning to swim away from Ulysses S. Grant, you've gone as far as you can go. So Confederates take refuge in Vicksburg, and eventually Grant does try to take Vicksburg by force, is repulsed a couple of times, and then eventually lays siege to Vicksburg. So you probably know that there was Vicksburg did not get taken right away. So here's the siege of Vicksburg. So this is a map that shows you kind of where all of this started. This is Jackson, Mississippi, and you can see the Union forces just moving further and further towards Vicksburg. So there's, here are the names of all those battles that I mentioned on the previous slide. Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, Black River Bridge. These are all Union victories as the Union is pushing the Confederacy back towards Vicksburg. And then here's another great quote. We've got all kinds of great quotes from Lincoln tonight. "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." So again, here's Lincoln also recognizing the value of Vicksburg and the Mississippi River at large. Another event taking place a little further downriver in Louisiana is the siege of Port Hudson. Now this one was supposed to be easy. Famous last words for a military commander, right? "Oh, this will be easy, no problem." Nathaniel Banks, who was the general commanding down in Louisiana, is tasked with capturing what they thought was a fairly small Confederate garrison at Port Hudson, Louisiana. Push those guys aside at Port Hudson and then keep marching north and come help Grant at Vicksburg. So Banks, like Grant at Vicksburg, tries to take Port Hudson by force, is repulsed. Banks then lays siege to Port Hudson as well. And I just mentioned here, I think it's noteworthy that in the first wave of attacks against Port Hudson, there were black soldiers from New Orleans, the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guard, fighting for the Union, trying to help the Union take Port Hudson unsuccessfully. And so Banks lays siege to Port Hudson, and that siege really lasts about as long as the siege at Vicksburg. It's not until much later that about 2 or 3 months later that finally Port Hudson surrenders. And the reason that Port Hudson surrenders is because the Confederate commander at Port Hudson learns that Vicksburg has now surrendered. So what's the point in continuing to hold on at Port Hudson? And so he eventually surrenders after learning that Vicksburg has surrendered to Grant. So at this point, once Vicksburg surrenders and once Port Hudson surrenders, the Union completely controls the Mississippi River. The Confederates are denied the Mississippi River, and for all intents and purposes, the Confederacy is cut in half. This is the only state that came into the Union during the war. We talked about a couple of territories. West by God, Virginia came into the Union on June 20th of 1863. So Virginia, at the beginning of the Civil War, is this whole thing. Virginia was huge. This is the Virginia we all know and love when we look at maps today. But at this point, what's now West Virginia was part of Virginia. There was a lot of Unionist sentiment in Western Virginia, and there were plenty of people in Western Virginia who did not want to secede and did not want to be part of the Confederacy. And so they created what they called the Restored Government of Virginia and applied for statehood. And of course, again, Lincoln is probably salivating at the idea of getting another northern state into the Union during the war. But he does, and this is 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is out there. And this is uncharted waters here in terms of a new state that does have slavery coming into the Union. We know that the Emancipation Proclamation exempted the 4 border states because he wanted to keep them from fleeing into the Confederacy. Here's a new state coming in that has slavery. How are we going to deal with that? And the answer is Lincoln requires the new state to have a plan for gradual emancipation. And the Willey Amendment is that plan. Children of slaves, this is for West Virginia. Children of slaves born after 4th of July 1863 shall be free. All slaves within this state who shall at time of aforesaid be under age of 10 years shall be free when they arrive at the age of 21 years. And all slaves over 10 and under 21 years shall be free when they arrive at age of 25 years. And no slave shall be permitted to come into the state for permanent residence therein. So there is West Virginia's plan for gradual emancipation of slaves. And then as it turned out, West Virginia just completely abolished slavery by, I believe it was sometime in 1865, not too long after the war ended. So that's West Virginia. So West Virginia is literally carved out of a Confederate state, comes into the Union right in the middle of the Civil War on June 20th, 1863. And then the last thing we'll talk about very quickly is just the surrender of Vicksburg, which takes place on July 4th, 1863, 24 hours after the Union victory at Gettysburg. So July 4th, 1863 is a good day for the Union in that they have accomplished 2 major victories just within a a day of each other. So this is this shows Grant right here meeting with John Pemberton, who was the Confederate commander of Vicksburg. Pemberton, of course, you've probably all the great stories about Confederates asking Grant for terms for surrender, and of course Grant says, no terms but unconditional surrender can be negotiated. So and that's in 1862, like at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. So here we are in mid-1863, and Pemberton asks Grant for terms, and Grant says, the useless effusion of blood you propose stopping by this course can be ended at any time you may choose, by the unconditional surrender of the city and garrison. So Grant's not messing around. And then here's a great note that Lincoln wrote to Henry Halleck, who was a high-ranking general in Washington. This is July 7th, 1863, just 3 days after the Confederates surrendered Vicksburg. This is Lincoln to Halleck. We have certain information that Vicksburg surrendered to General Grant on the 4th of July. Now, if General Meade, who just won the Battle of Gettysburg, if General Meade can complete his work so gloriously prosecuted thus far by the literal or substantial destruction of Lee's army, the rebellion will be over. Did the rebellion end in July 1863? It did not. So how about this? We'll tease you for November 7th. A lot of that, General Meade did not do what Lincoln hoped he would do. He did exactly what Lee hoped he would do, which was let him go. But we'll talk more about that in November. So that concludes my part. So I don't know, John, if you want to say anything else. Or
I only have the following. Henry Adams was a young man from Boston. He came from a very prominent family. He was a direct descendant of John Quincy Adams. His father, Charles Francis Adams Sr., was the ambassador to Great Britain, and he was in London. And on July 23rd, he writes the following letter to his brother, Charles Francis Adams Jr. I positively tremble to think of receiving any more news from America since the batch that we received last Sunday. Now, it takes 2 weeks for a steamer 11 days to 2 weeks for a steamer to get across the Atlantic. Why can't we just sink the steamers till some more good news comes? It's like an easterly storm after a glorious June day, this returning to the gloomy chronicle of varying successes and disasters after exulting in the grand excitement of such triumphs as you sent us on the 4th. For once there was no drawback, unless I accept anxiety about you. I wanted to hug the Army of the Potomac. I wanted to get the whole Army of Vicksburg drunk at my own expense. I wanted to fight some small man and lick him. So I love that as a quote because it's just so many Northerners who were constantly getting used to this sort of like good news, bad news, good news, bad news, bad news, bad news, and felt divorced from it. But you have this moment where he's just like, yeah, God, this is so great. I just want to find some jerk and really pop him to just to express my joy at finally, like, we've achieved these unequivocal successes. What would happen in the rest of 1863? Well, you'll have to see whether the successes were built on or whether they were allowed to slip through people's fingers. But thank you so much for your attention, and we will see you again in a month's time.